Boa tarde a todos. Desculpem o atraso, a gente estava tentando resolver o problema de cadeiras extras no auditório. Conseguimos aqui o máximo que a gente pôde, mas temos também uma outra sala onde está sendo transmitido o evento no outro auditório pequeno, devido ao sucesso aqui do professor Mark Tushnet e dos debatedores. Quero agradecer a presença de todos que compõem a mesa, especialmente o Carlos Afonso Pereira de Souza, que não é da casa, que veio... É da casa porque é um amigo da casa, mas veio de fora, também da Ana Carolina Miguel e do Henrique Rocha. E agradecer especialmente a presença do professor Mark Tushnet, que veio para o Brasil, na verdade, para Porto Alegre e Curitiba, mas fez o esforço de dar essa esticadinha aqui para o Rio de Janeiro, o que foi ótimo para a gente, porque o custo é até mais barato. Então, deu essa esticadinha aqui para nos brindar com o seu conhecimento e com a sua conferência. It's an honor for us, Professor, to have you here. Professor Mark Tushnet, para quem não conhece, é professor de Direito na cadeira William Nelson Cromwell, da Harvard Law School, é formado pela Faculdade de Direito de Harvard, pela Faculdade de Direito de Yale, especialista em Direito e Teoria Constitucional, já avisou que vai abordar o tema sob a perspectiva do direito constitucional. Ele é um estudioso de direito constitucional comparado, analisa o sistema constitucional de diversos países, está escrevendo no momento um livro... Está escrevendo um livro sobre combate à corrupção, né, sistemas, medidas anticorrupção, e, por acaso, o Brasil virou uma referência para esse tema no livro dele. Então, foi muito bom tê-lo aqui, conseguir trazê-lo ao Rio de Janeiro. E, sem mais delongas, eu passo a palavra a ele para a conferência principal. Depois da conferência principal, a gente vai ter as provocações efetuadas pelos debatedores. Professor. Okay. Só enquanto o professor se ajusta, queria avisar também que a gente tem diversos livros do professor Tushnet disponíveis na nossa biblioteca e todos podem acessar os livros lá.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the various hosts, both institutional and personal, who have made it so easy for me to travel to and in Brazil to give a number of talks. And I appreciate in particular the turnout, the number of you who have come to express interest in what I have to say. The talk I'm giving is based on the final chapter of a book on freedom of expression that will be published at the end of this year. And I need to say one thing about the argument of the book in general before turning to the specifics of the new social media. The argument I develop in the book is something I'll call in the talk this afternoon the basic idea. And the basic idea is that courts and constitutional law should generally, generally accept the decisions made by legislatures, the policies adopted by legislatures, including policies regulating expression, unless there's some reason to think that the legislature was influenced badly by political self-interest or other kinds of distortions. And just to anticipate one of my conclusions, in the area of the regulation of the new social media, at the moment, it doesn't seem to me clear that there are those kinds of distortions in the legislative process, and therefore whatever policies legislatures come up with probably ought to be accepted as constitutionally permissible. One final word before I start on the substance of the talk. I am a specialist in constitutional law, not in the new social media or information technology law and the like. I don't have particularly well-informed views on what good policy would be. I suppose I do have some views on what I think policy should be, but they're worth no more weight than you would give the weight of the judgment of anybody of your friends who had thought about this, probably more than I have. Okay, so with that as the preface, let me begin. Free expression law developed in response to publication of books and pamphlets criticizing government policy and to street demonstrations and riots. The law had to adapt to changing technology. Daily newspapers rather than occasional pamphlets, radio and then television, but it turned out the basic principles developed to deal with the old problems were generally suitable to deal with the new ones. Some minor adjustments were needed, especially in schemes for licensing access to limited resources, including city streets and radio spectrum. But the guiding principles and the institutional concerns that gave them structure turned out to be relatively unchanging. Now, many observers believe that modern technological developments, social media and the internet generally, have pushed us into a new era. Formulating the concerns requires some care because the new media presents several distinct problems. Regulations that are constitutionally permissible for older forms of communication may turn out to be ineffective when applied to new forms, and I'll illustrate that in a moment. Regulations that might be effective might also be impermissible under current understandings of free expression law, and that might generate pressure to reformulate those understandings so that effective regulation can be maintained. One specific source of ineffectiveness is geographic. The new media can escape domestic regulations by relocating elsewhere in ways that newspapers can't. In addition, the balance between the harms of speech and the benefits of allowing it might change as the scale of distribution of information changes. Now, it might be possible to overcome old institutional constraints that structure free expression law, for example, as I'll indicate, by using international treaties rather than domestic law, but new institutional constraints might emerge. And finally, some contend that the private actors who write the code underlying the new media effectively control what can be disseminated. Legislators representing the public might want to replace those privately generated regulations with public ones, but free expression law might stand in their way. Because I'm going to be talking about emerging issues, I can't describe the settled law of free expression with respect to these issues. But I can indicate some directions that the law might take, how new solutions might fit into the overall structure of free expression law. One important possibility must be kept in mind throughout. The solutions to some new problems might simply be the application of existing law without significant modification. Now, I begin with problems associated with geography. In a recent case from the Canadian Supreme Court, the court wrote, "The internet has no borders." That case involved the remedy for violating a company's trade secret rights, and the court held that the only effective remedy would require Google to de-index the seller's website from the lists it produces for searches. That is, to make it impossible for the violator's website to show up when you did a search for the product. Suppose, though, that Google, located in the United States, asserts a free expression defense against de-indexing, and that an injunction against de-indexing would violate free expression as understood in U.S. law. The Internet's characteristics would make effective regulation impossible, even though such regulation is consistent with free expression law as understood in Canada. Now, the pattern repeats itself. There are cases involving a French anti-racist group that got an injunction in France against a website hosting an auction selling Nazi memorabilia. The French anti-racist group wanted the injunction to be enforced by Yahoo, located in the United States. Yahoo resisted, asserting U.S. free expression defenses. The case washed out in the United States without a clear result. Similarly, the European Court of Justice has held that EU citizens have a right to be forgotten, right that is in the EU understood to be of constitutional dimensions. The right to be forgotten gives individuals a right to demand that internet search engines delete information about them that is outdated or irrelevant to any current matter of interest. In the United States, where Google has its headquarters, a right to be forgotten, understood as a right to prevent newspapers from publishing outdated personal information, would in many circumstances be unconstitutional. Can the European order of a right to be forgotten, in a case involving a European citizen, can that order be enforced against Google? Okay, so those are examples of the geographical problem. Now, these are problems where the extraterritorial application of domestic legal rules consistent with domestic interpretations of principles of free expression might be unconstitutional under some other nation's interpretation of those same principles. Such problems did not arise only after the development of the Internet. A Canadian injunction against publishing details about a lurid crime was ineffective because those same details were published in U.S. newspapers and broadcast over U.S. radio and television stations easily accessible within Canada. And today you can imagine the dissemination of that information via a YouTube video of a US-based presentation of the information. Now, how should the legal system deal with these problems? Now, note the formulation. The question is about the legal system as a whole, not free expression law. Because in the end, most of the problems of geography arise from international law. The first question is whether the domestic legal rule, Canadian trade secret law, the French law against selling Nazi memorabilia, has extraterritorial legal effect from the perspective of the domestic jurisdiction, Canada or France. The next question is whether the second jurisdiction's domestic law, in the examples, the United States, recognizes whatever extraterritorial effect there might be. In the first instance, that's a question of international law. Suppose that the legal rule is intended to have extraterritorial effect, and that the second jurisdiction would ordinarily give it such effect. But suppose, again, as in the examples, the second jurisdiction, again the United States, would hold the legal rule unconstitutional were it applied in an entirely local dispute. The extent to which that should affect the analysis of the problems is here a question of general constitutional law. A legal system might treat unconstitutionality under domestic law as dispositive against the foreign judgment, or it might take that unconstitutionality to be relevant but not dispositive. Treaties might address some of these and similar problems, though they can eliminate them entirely only if we make some assumptions about the role of treaties within domestic legal systems. Consider an international treaty obligating signatories to enforce libel judgments found constitutionally permissible by the highest court in the jurisdiction issuing them. It's a question of domestic constitutional law whether a treaty can override otherwise applicable constitutional rules, or whether the existence of a treaty should influence how a domestic court should interpret domestic principles of free expression. Now, these problems of geographical application of rules found consistent by one jurisdiction with its understanding of free expression are serious ones, but their solution, if there is one, lies in principles of international law and general constitutional law, not in free expression law. I turn now to more, I think, substantial and pressing problems, problems associated with, I would say, scale, the size of the problem or the amount of information disseminated. I begin with a U.S. example. The internet transformed the industry involved in the disseminating of sexually explicit depictions in the United States and probably here known as pornography. Material that would be obscene in some U.S. jurisdictions and that therefore could be banned in those jurisdictions became available everywhere. Effective enforcement of constitutionally permissible regulations of obscene materials became impossible because the internet vastly increased its distribution and put its producers and distributors out of reach of jurisdictions that wish to and permissibly could regulate it. Here, scale and geography interact. Another widely discussed problem is that of internet trolls. These trolls come in various guises, but the core free expression issue arises in this way. A person makes a statement about some issue of public policy. People use social media to comment critically on the statement. Some of those criticisms take the form of seeming threats to physically harm the initial speaker, and those threats come to the speaker's attention. I should note that I have been subject to this sort of trolling, and one of the harms that I will describe actually not of being physically harmed, but of being threatened, I actually experienced one of those harms. Another important variant blends the political with the personal. A man, this is taken from a U.S. case, but it's a common pattern. A man vents his frustration about how the police or the courts have treated him in connection with a domestic dispute by using strong language amounting to a threat against the police, the judge, his partner, and her lawyers. The existence of social media may loosen conventional constraints on expression so that people who would be reluctant to make threats face-to-face or even in a letter are less reluctant to do so over the internet. Now, free expression law has a relatively well-settled approach to threats. Again, I'm drawing from the U.S. law, but what the U.S. law says is quite similar to the solutions reached in other jurisdictions. Threats cause various harms that legislatures can address. Targets sometimes take steps to reduce the possibility that the threat will succeed by hiding, by hiring security guards, and the like. They suffer the psychological harm of being placed in fear, and their quiet repose, a phrase used in the common law, is disturbed. It's the psychological harm of being placed in fear that was realized in my case. For a couple of days, I sort of worried a little about going into my office and thinking about whether there was a place for me to hide under my desk if somebody came in. It wasn't a serious threat. I didn't really take it seriously, but it was on my mind. My wife was even more disturbed. Nothing at all happened as a result, but some of the threats were placed on our home telephone, and she got the message. So it's not a pleasant experience, even if nothing happens afterwards. The problem is that discourse about public matters often contains what the U.S. court called political hyperbole. That is an exaggerated statement made to emphasize the depth of the speaker's disagreement with the policy that he or she is opposing. And it's hyperbole in the sense that there probably is no real intent to act upon it. So the case in which the U.S. Supreme Court came up or used this distinction involved a statement, if they ever make me carry a rifle, the first man I want to get in my sights is President Lyndon Baines Johnson. Now, this was not a real threat to Lyndon Johnson. It was political hyperbole. And what the Supreme Court says is, and properly so, you have to distinguish between mere political hyperbole and true threats. Now, there are several candidates for identifying a true threat. One is subjective and focuses on the person making the threat. Did that person intend to carry it out when the circumstances for doing so presented themselves? Another is subjective and focuses on the target. Was the target actually put in fear when she learned that the threat had been made? And a third is objective. Would a reasonable target be placed in fear upon learning of the threat? We can choose among the possible standards by thinking about each one's chilling effect, a well-known phenomenon in free speech law. The underlying concern is that the rule we adopt might impose a cost on free expression by punishing and deterring mere hyperbole. Now, the target-focused subjective standard allows liability to be imposed when an unusually sensitive target experiences fear when most other people would not. We might say that this standard gives the target something close to a veto over what others can say, and so is likely to have the largest chilling effect. The difficulty with the other standards is somewhat different. The concern is that the ultimate decision maker on liability, in the U.S. a jury, in most other systems a judge, will mistakenly find that a speaker who merely intended to make a hyperbolic statement actually intended to carry out the threat, or will mistakenly find that a reasonable person would be placed in fear upon learning of what is actually only a hyperbolic statement. Now, notably, all the standards pose the risk of mistakenly imposing liability for mere political hyperbole. But in light of the fact that the harms imposed by threats are serious ones, legislatures, I think, can reasonably choose to penalize true threats, notwithstanding the fact that doing so will chill some merely hyperbolic statements. The question is about the amount of the chill. And once again, the basic idea that I mentioned at the outset should guide the development of free expression law. Has the legislature chosen a reasonable standard? Now, one might contend with some force that the target-focused subjective account is unreasonable because of the power it gives to unusual, especially sensitive targets. But both the speaker-focused subjective standard and the objective standard appear to me to be quite reasonable, and whichever the legislature chooses satisfies the requirements of free expression law. The U.S. Supreme Court resolved the case I described by seeing it as a question of statutory interpretation and not free expression law. Now, importantly, nothing in what I've talked about here turns on the fact that internet trolls operate over the internet. Here, technological change alters the scale of the problem. There are many more internet trolls than there were people making these statements on the borderline between political hyperbole and true threats. But the problem, but the analytic framework we use to address the problem doesn't change. Now, I want to turn to another related problem, that of what's known in the United States, and again, I assume here, as revenge porn, which in the internet context, again, raises issues of scale. Revenge porn, revenge porn consists of revealing photographs taken before a couple separated, then distributed to embarrass the person depicted as revenge for typically her actions in breaking off the relationship. These are actions that probably are best understood as invasions of privacy, and we know how to analyze laws imposing liability for invasions of privacy. Depending on the underlying law, they'll be described as problems involving free expression rights against a constitutional right of privacy, or, as in the United States, a free expression right as against a mere interest in privacy. I don't want to go into the details of that distinction here. If you want to pursue it afterwards, we can talk about it. Is a law imposing liability for distributing revenge porn different from a standard invasion of privacy law? Now, proposals for such laws begin with the observation that revenge porn is primarily a phenomenon of distribution through social media. Standard invasion of privacy laws, in contrast, allow for liability quite broadly, but they raise interesting free expression questions almost exclusively when a newspaper or magazine publishes something that's alleged to invade privacy. But notably, the newspaper acts as a screening agent, invoking some sort of newsworthiness standard in choosing to publish. In contrast, there's no similar screening agency for revenge porn. And further, the use of social media for distribution means that revenge porn is more likely to reach viewers who know the person depicted, indicating that the invasion of privacy may be particularly serious. Diminishing a person's stature in the eyes of her friends may be more harmful to her than diminishing her status among the public generally, who might not even know who she is. And finally, the social media may simply reach many more people than newspapers and magazines. So the latter two reasons suggest that the harms inflicted by revenge porn are of significantly larger scale than occur in traditional invasion of privacy cases. It would be relatively easy, I think, to find a revenge porn statute constitutionally permissible under a balancing or proportionality analysis. We'd start with a traditional invasion of privacy law. A jurisdiction might hold that, on balance, imposing liability on newspapers or magazines for invasion of privacy, for publishing what they regard as newsworthy material, impairs free expression more than it protects personal privacy, or it might allow liability, but only when the courts determine that the material was not newsworthy. Or, of course, it might allow liability quite generally, finding that invasions of privacy typically outweigh the public benefit of publishing intrusive material. With revenge porn, there's no newsworthiness screen at all, suggesting that it would be easy to find that the infringement of free expression rights was relatively small, impairing only the free expression rights of individuals unconnected to the distribution of material of interest to a wide audience. And it would similarly be relatively easy to find that the intrusion on privacy was likely to be a relatively large one, given the sexually charged nature of the pictures distributed. The problem under a system like the U.S. is somewhat different, and I'm not going to go into it here. The summary is that on their surface, the problems posed by internet trolls and revenge porn fit reasonably well within established components of free expression law. They are threats and invasions of privacy. Now, there are recent laws, including one recently enacted in Germany, that suggest that technology does complicate the problems in two ways. The first is a simple one and easy to deal with. In prior eras, it was relatively easy for a target to know who was threatening her or invading her privacy. But as the famous cartoon has it, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. That is, speakers using social media can rather easily conceal their identities. So a rule that imposes liability only on the person using the internet to make a threat or to invade privacy might not be as effective as such a rule applied to traditional media. Now, we can come up with various procedural devices to reduce the problems posed by anonymity, such as allowing targets to get information from intermediaries, platform operators like Facebook, about who put the information on the platform. And such procedural devices raise no substantial free expression issues. But the second problem is that a natural response to these difficulties is to impose liability under some circumstances both on the person making the threat or invading privacy, and under some circumstances on the intermediaries themselves. So consider a statute this is what the German statute does in a way that I'll describe soon. Consider a statute imposing liability on an intermediary for disseminating a threat. The liability will induce the intermediary to screen material submitted for dissemination to to determine whether it is a threat. And whatever the threat standard is, the intermediary will inevitably prevent the distribution of material that is not a threat. That's liability's chilling effect again. Now, free expression law is generally structured so as to try to reduce chilling effects. The German statute that I've referred to takes one approach. What it does, as I interpret it, although my interpretation is, I think, controversial, is this. It imposes liability not for disseminating the material, but for failing to have a system in place for determining whether the material is a threat. Now, even that approach will have some chilling effect, because whatever system they have will, again, inevitably identify some statements as threats that aren't true threats. But the mere fact that the intermediary disseminated something later determined to be a threat would not itself be a basis for liability. Again, I can go into the details of the German statute in our discussion later. Now, we can readily come up with rules that protect intermediaries even more substantially. Liability for recklessly distributing a threat, or liability for distributing a threat after having been notified by the target of the existence of prior threats, a sort of takedown approach as it's used in intellectual property law, or liability for distributing what the intermediary knows to be a threat. Again, whether those rules are consistent with free expression principles rests almost entirely on answers to questions about how substantial each one's chilling effect is, and at some point, free expression law will have to accept legislative judgments about the chilling effect size. Another problem. Recent elections in several nations have raised another new version of an old problem. This is roughly speaking the problem of fake news, although I'm going to define that problem in a perhaps peculiar way. I frame the problem in light of campaign finance regulation. Some campaign finance regulation rests on the proposition that voters are receiving too much information from one side, not enough from another. Now, there are a variety of ways of describing the problem, but one is this. Voters have limited time and attention to devote to politics, and they can be overwhelmed by the sheer volume of material that is sent their way. Sheer repetition affects the views voters take of some issues and candidate, a distortion of deliberation that goes beyond the usual impact that emotion has upon reason. Now, one way of thinking about campaign finance regulation is to look at it from the perspective not of the speakers, of the candidates, but of the listeners, the voters. And if you take that perspective, it's, again, relatively straightforward to devise regulations that deal with the problem of information flooding in a familiar conceptual structure. Although, again, the internet adds a layer of complication. To begin, is the harm of information overload one that the government can permissibly address? The justification is unabashedly paternalist. In the legislature's view, people are unable to determine for themselves when they've heard enough about some issue or candidate that they can turn away from additional efforts to say the same thing to them. And paternalism, we might think, is not a permissible basis for regulating information. But that anti-paternalist justification is overstated. Paternalist regulation of information is common even in speaker-focused systems of free expression law, governments require producers of potentially harmful products to disclose information about the harms, even though potential consumers could discover that information on their own. So I think a decent recent example involves disclosures about the harms of smoking tobacco. That's an interesting example because it's not clear that the disclosures actually have much effect. More general public education about the harms of tobacco smoking appears to be more significant than these particular disclosures. Nonetheless, the disclosures are thought to be permissible constitutionally. Even more, governments can ban harmful products rather than allow them to be sold with full disclosure of the potential harms, on the theory that potential buyers are likely to misunderstand the disclosures. Let's see. Finally, on this issue, recall the basic idea that underlying free expression law encompasses the idea that legislatures can choose among reasonable political theories as justifications for the regulation they enact. Although a fully general paternalism might not be a reasonable political theory, a political theory that allows for discrete exercises of paternalism is almost certainly a reasonable one. So legislatures can choose to treat the harm of information flooding as worth addressing. If we find the person doing the flooding, imposing liability is straightforward. The more interesting problem involves someone who encourages others to flood social media with information. Could a legislature disqualify candidates for office who encourage their supporters to retweet their messages or to like other social media messages that are fake news, where there's a real possibility that such encouragement will lead to information flooding? I should note that this encouragement of retweeting, appears to be the mechanism of information flooding in the Russian intervention in the US election. It's not that the Russian bots planted so many items of information. Rather, it's that people who saw them were encouraged in a variety of ways to re-disseminate them. Okay. Now, a first analogy here, again, to the encouragement of the retweeting of false news, fake news. A first analogy might be to standard ideas about aiding and abetting, or being an accessory to conduct the legislature can treat as harmful. Among those ideas are so-called mental elements, intent that specific listeners, or perhaps a small subset of listeners, engage in information flooding, knowledge that some listeners will do so, recklessness about whether information flooding will result from the candidate's encouraging statements. The looser the required mental element, the larger the effect on deterring or chilling, once again, candidate speech. Another important idea in the law of aiding and abetting is proximity to success. The person who sells ink to someone who publishes prohibited obscene materials has enabled the unlawful action, but it would be absurd and inconsistent with any sensible account of free expression to allow the legislature to treat the ink seller as an accessory to publishing obscenity. Similarly, with someone who sells computers to people who engage in information flooding. Now, in other settings, we treat proximity of the question of proximity as one of degree, leaving it to the ultimate decision makers to determine whether the candidate's actions are close enough to information flooding. Here too, we might worry about unconsciously biased decision makers who might find, for example, that insurgent political candidates are close enough to information flooding while more traditional ones are not. The image for the US would be that the decision makers would say Trump is proximate to success of information flooding, but his opponents, Ted Cruz, are not. That is a real risk that we have to worry about. Concerns about chilling effects are important here. We might well worry about taking the view that free expression law allows imposing liability on anyone who aids and abets any form of unlawful speech, even if the aiding and abetting is defined to require one of the stricter mental elements and a finding of proximity to the unlawful action. The breadth of such potential liability might have a substantial chilling effect on many types of speech. We might allow for more targeted versions of aiding and abetting liability. We would require the legislature to take a more tailored approach, that's the US language, or adopt a less restrictive means, the proportionality formulation. Perhaps it would be permissible for a legislature to identify information flooding as a particular problem as to which aiding and abetting liability would attach, or perhaps the legislature could identify specific forms of encouragement that are especially likely to lead to information flooding. Now, of course, if it's enough that the legislature identify information flooding as a specific problem, in principle, it could identify other harms as to which aiding and abetting liability could attach. And that presents another facet of the basic idea about deference to reasonable legislative choices. Here the question would be, do we trust legislatures to impose aiding and abetting liability only where doing so is a reasonable way of addressing a relatively narrow or well-defined harm? Now, all of these problems, I want to stress, have a similar structure. New technologies make available new versions of old problems. The new versions operate on a different scale from the old ones. Sometimes scale doesn't matter, and the solutions free expression law had reached for the old problems are suitable for the new ones. I think, for example, that the law dealing with threats might be sufficient to deal with internet trolls. Sometimes scale matters a bit, and tinkering with existing solutions might be sufficient, preserving the core of the old solutions while modifying some peripheral features. But perhaps unfortunately, sometimes, to use an old phrase, quantity turns into quality. The problem on a large scale is quite different from the analogous small-scale problem. Then the questions are two. How can we tell that the scale of the new problem makes it truly different from the old problem, only similarly seemingly similar to the present one? And once we do, how can we deal with the new problem? I say perhaps unfortunately because I have to leave my discussion at this point. They are among the most important questions on the horizon, and because they're on the horizon, I really don't have anything useful to say about them. My final general topic, although it's going to take a while to explore sufficiently, are problems associated with private control of important media. I begin with really two related examples. In 2010, Facebook supported a social science experiment that manipulated information provided to users by Facebook to determine whether that information could increase turnout on election day. It could, it turns out. 6 years later, former Facebook employees charged that the company manipulated the trending site section of the site to downplay trends favoring conservatives. Facebook denied that it had done so. Put these two episodes together and think about, we can see how Facebook might manipulate what its users saw, not to increase turnout overall, but to increase turnout by voters who supported candidates Facebook's owners favored. This is, in some ways, Facebook doing what Cambridge, doing for its favored candidate, what Cambridge Analytica did for Trump. Identify people who are on your side and send them messages that you know will have the effect of increasing their likelihood of turning out. Okay, so you might worry about Facebook's ability to do what I've just described. Facebook, Twitter, Google all dominate segments of the social media economy in the way that some manufacturers used to dominate segments of the traditional economy. Their owners, Facebook, Twitter, and Google, can exploit that dominance to their own ends, or unless the owners themselves intervene, third parties like Cambridge Analytica can do so. And because these companies operate in the domain of information, some scholars have suggested that something should be done to reduce the risk that they can exercise an undesirable amount of political influence. Invoke ideas akin to those deployed in antitrust law to break these companies up, or impose duties on them akin to those imposed on public utilities that, for technical reasons, necessarily held local monopolies. Again, I want to stress this too may only be a modern manifestation of an old problem. The U.S. media critic A.J. Liebling wrote in 1960, "Freedom of the press is guaranteed only to those who own one." Is the control Google and Facebook have over the codes their employees write different from the control newspaper owners have over the editorial content of their papers? Here too, scale might matter. Historically, some newspapers had monopolies in their cities, and more do so today. But of course, the overall media environment is quite competitive. The major private actors on the internet might have enough control over some aspects of information distribution to lead legislators to search for methods to regulate them in the public interest, and perhaps that search is a reasonable one. Are there paths open to reasonable regulation of these companies that are consistent with free expression law? Well, let me start with a general principle taken from the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court, but it is quite generally applicable. Newspapers, the U.S. court said, have no special immunity from the application of general laws, including antitrust laws. Now, one such general law is contract law. Facebook and Twitter offer potential users terms of service that define what users can post, and importantly, what Facebook and Twitter can do with the information that the users provide. The companies offer these terms basically on a take-it-or-leave-it basis, and given the firm's domination of the markets within which they operate, they are almost certainly what contract scholars would call contracts of adhesion. And as a matter of general contract law, the government has the power to regulate terms in contracts of adhesion. Perhaps then the general law of contract could be invoked to prevent Facebook and Twitter from using information they acquire from their users in political experiments, or more broadly, as the basis for sending messages to users that the companies select, or as the basis for blocking messages users try to send. On the face of things, though, Such a regulation would be information specific, or in traditional free expression terms, content-based, and as such, it might have to be justified by very strong reasons. The government might have to show a close causal connection between limiting the company's ability to choose which messages to spread, and some important government interests, and doing so might well be quite difficult. These regulations could be treated as general laws if we can identify rules about what can and can't be included of contracts of adhesion that are even roughly analogous. It's not clear that there are such rules, but perhaps contract law deployed on users' behalf might accomplish something. Similarly with antitrust law, we can treat antitrust law as general law, and then we would apply ordinary antitrust principles to Facebook, Twitter, and Google. So if a nation's antitrust law allows the government to break up companies simply because they're too large, that principle could be invoked against them. But when France sought to limit the growth of media empires, in the specific case, newspapers moving into broadcast media, with a specific law on press expansion, the French Constitutional Council objected, and I think properly so. It said that expansion could be limited if the newspapers engaged in various bad tactics that helped them expand, but not if their growth resulted from natural forces, meaning from uncoerced consumer choices. Now, that identifies one important difficulty. Today's large internet companies may have achieved their size by natural growth. They may have succeeded because they have provided users with a better product than their rivals did, as consumers saw it. That's clearest in the case of Google, less so with true social media companies. Google's domination of the market for search engines doesn't prevent anyone from coming up with a better search engine. Facebook and Twitter are different because they provide what are technically known as network services. The benefits a new user gets from signing up flow from the fact that lots and lots of people have already signed up. Antitrust law is not a good response to the size of such services. Public utility regulation, which I'll get to in a moment, is more promising. Before turning to public utility regulation, though, one cautionary note. The world of social media is quite young. Facebook was launched in the mid-2000s and took off around 2010. Twitter began a little later, and it expanded rapidly a bit sooner. Even the network characterization of Facebook and Twitter can be challenged. Alternatives or supplements such as Instagram and Tumblr have grown. By some measures, Instagram is larger than Twitter. The history of social media is one of surges and declines of specific modes and even more companies. The literature on social media is filled with comments like, remember MySpace and Ask Jeeves, and eventually, within 5 years, I would have to explain what that meant because people would not, in fact, remember MySpace and Ask Jeeves. These were companies that soared into prominence and then receded into the background or even disappeared. Today, we're apparently experiencing a substantial decline in the role of blogs, which were displaced by Facebook posts, and now, I think it's true, I haven't seen any studies, but my sense of things is that Facebook posts are being replaced by Twitter feeds. I know of people who once were active bloggers who became, who reduced their blogging and shifted to Facebook, and then shifted from Facebook to Twitter as the way of getting their ideas across. It may be that we should hold our breath and see what happens rather than develop regulations and attempt them to fit into or modify free expression law. Now turn to public utility regulation. Governments regulate privately owned suppliers of electricity, telephone service, water, and more under the heading of public utilities. And some of the ideas associated with public utility regulation might be deployed in regulating large internet entities like Facebook and Google. Yale Law professor Jack Balkin has started to talk about these entities as information fiduciaries, trustees for the public of the information people give to them. And the fiduciary idea is drawn from the law of public utilities. Now, the constitutional question is not whether such entities are exactly the same as the public utilities governments have regulated, but it is instead whether they are enough like traditional public utilities that ideas and policies associated with public utility regulation can help us devise and then analyze under free expression law internet regulations. Traditional public utilities have several characteristics. They provide people with important goods because of their economic characteristics. They tend toward monopoly or near monopoly. Facebook and Twitter have something similar. They're not the same as what public utilities have, but again, the network phenomenon is the more people using the service, the more valuable it is to other potential users. Again, I want to raise here a question about Google. Google provides an important service, but there appears to be nothing other than good design that makes Google a better search engine than Bing or DuckDuckGo, if indeed it is a better search engine. Some things I've read suggest that DuckDuckGo is a better search engine than Google. And if so, eventually the market should lead to people going to DuckDuckGo. There's no reason to prefer a worse service to a better one. Now, the core of traditional public utility regulation couples two elements: a common carrier obligation, which requires utilities to provide service to all who seek it, and price regulation, typically a requirement of non-discrimination, or charge the same price to people within the same class of users. Here, the analogy to internet service providers is clear. In principle, a government could require that every internet service provider offer its services to everyone at the same cost, that is net neutrality. The government could allow or prescribe different rates for different categories of users, where the categories were defined, for example, by the amount of use. Internet service providers could be allowed to charge heavy users higher prices than those who use the service less often. These are policy choices that ordinarily would raise no free expression concerns. What about categories defined by the content of what is being transmitted? I here won't go into the details, but there are several cases in the United States involving the regulated television industry, in which the court has allowed the regulators to impose requirements based upon content. And so it might be that net neutrality coupled with modest preferences for some kinds of expression and perhaps some modest disadvantages for other kinds of expression are consistent with free expression law. If so, the reason is, once again, that there appear to be no obvious institutional biases at work when regulators devise these regulations. Let's see. Oh, okay. Facebook and Twitter have some similarities to traditional public utilities, but the concerns people express about Facebook and Twitter are in some ways the flip side, not the same as, but the other side of concerns associated with traditional public utilities. There, we're worried about discrimination against users. With Facebook and Twitter, people worry about policies that make them too available for cyber stalking, cyberbullying, dissemination of fake news, and the like. Allowing Facebook and Twitter to exclude users who cyberstalk and the like is entirely consistent with traditional public utilities law. More problematic might be requirements imposed on Facebook and Twitter saying that they must exclude cyber stalkers. Again, I think, well, my truly final observation is that the problems that I've discussed so far arise from problems some observers see in how privately owned companies might act. A famous phrase by Larry Lessig captures the underlying idea, code as law. That is, the decisions Facebook and Twitter and Google make function in practical terms to structure people's lives in ways not readily distinguishable from the way that the law does. If we think, as we do, that we the people acting through elections should control those who make law, Lessig suggests, we should think that we should be able to control those who write code, at least where the code writers exercise power similar in scope to that exercised by our lawmakers. The idea, that is that just as there is democratic control of legislatures, there should be democratic control of powerful internet entities. The difficulty, of course, is that we control lawmakers in two ways, through elections and through constitutional limits on their power, including free expression law. And writing code is expression. It took me a while to appreciate this, but I've now come to put it this way. Technically, code is simply a language like Portuguese. People who know code can look at a page of code and understand what it says, means, and does. I can look at a page of Portuguese and not have no idea what it says. I can look at a page of code and have no idea what it says. But there's no difference, I think, in principle between Portuguese and code as a form of expression. So any law we might enact to control powerful internet entities based on the idea that they are effectively lawmakers when they write code must satisfy free expression law's requirements. But it's worth emphasizing that free expression law does allow for the regulation of expression. It just sets the conditions under which such regulation is permissible. And so I think what we ought to do about code is to think about what the analogies to the permissible bounds of regulation of, I don't know, traditional expression would be. One way to think about this is to think again about campaign finance regulation. Campaign finance regulations are said to be in the service of democracy itself in a way that regulation of speech causing unlawful action is not. So too are regulations of powerful internet entities. They are democratically developed regulations aimed at promoting democracy. Now, we might have some misgivings about whether particular campaign finance regulations rest on a truly disinterested assessment of what best promotes democracy. It's not clear that similar misgivings should attend regulations of powerful internet entities. The misgivings associated with campaign finance regulations might not be strong enough to rebut the deference recommended by the basic analysis. Similarly, perhaps with internet regulations, we should defer to reasonable legislative judgments that one or another regulation does promote democracy. Now, truly, finally, as we've seen, proportionality analysis might seem to provide an easy fix for new problems because it seems to allow modest adjustments at one or another step, just enough to deal with the problem at hand, increase the scale of the harm, and a regulation whose adverse impact on speech was previously disproportionate might become proportionate. From the other direction, issues of scale might lead judges in systems more like the US to tweak the categories modestly, as US judges have done. As before, the distinction between proportionality and categorical approaches may narrow as new problems present themselves. And again, I will conclude where I started. Existing structures of legal doctrine may be completely adequate to deal with emerging problems of free expression law. Thank you.
Quero agradecer ao professor Mark Tushnet pela magnífica palestra, que sem nenhum risco de hyperbolic statements, fixa aqui pontos fundamentais para o debate desse tema no Brasil. Vamos então passar à segunda etapa do evento, que é a discussão, o debate dessas ideias, com todos nós presentes, mas começando naturalmente pelos debatedores que estão na mesa.